No one in the dry saltpan of Lake Mungo expected that Jim Bowler would pick at a patch of crusted clay and change the story of human history in Australia. It was 1969 when Bowler, a young geologist from the Australian National University, paused on the ancient shoreline of the Willandra Lakes, more out of curiosity than destiny. What he uncovered, a scatter of charred bone fragments that came to be called Mungo Lady, looked at first like ordinary fossil detritus. It was anything but. Bowler's careful work turned up not only human bones, but evidence of ritual, cremation fragments, and traces of red ochre. 5 years later, in 1974, he found a more complete burial, Mungo Man, laid supine, coated in ochre, the ochre staining the sediments like a deliberate ancient signature. These were not mere fossils, they were human lives, treated with ceremony, preserved in a landscape that had been a freshwater lake tens of thousands of years earlier. The scientific implications were seismic. Early radiocarbon dates placed human activity at Lake Mungo well beyond what many had assumed for Australia. Later refinements in dating methods, optically stimulated luminescence among them, pushed the age of those burials toward roughly 40,000 years before present. That made Lake Mungo among the oldest known sites of anatomically modern humans outside Africa, and suggested that complex burial rituals and symbolic behavior appeared very early in Australia's prehistory. But discovery brought not only acclaim, it brought conflict. The bones were removed to institutions in Canberra for analysis. For the local Aboriginal communities, the West Mungo people and their successors, the remains were not specimens, but ancestors, sacred living ties to country. They demanded return. Scientists argued for study. Bureaucracy and the conventions of mid-20th century science produced months and then years of silence, paperwork, and delay. What unfolded was less a single deliberate plot than a pattern. The scientific establishment, museums and universities operating on long-held assumptions about ownership of ancient remains, and indigenous people asserting a fundamentally different conception of care and custody. This tension became a public and political story. Aboriginal leaders framed their struggle in terms that resonated nationally, not only grief, but a challenge to the authority of science when it ignored human rights and spiritual law. Scholars began to interrogate the ethics of excavation and the underlying assumptions of cultural imperialism, whose history was being written and at what cost. Over the next decades, the story moved through courtroom-like debates, government reviews, and community campaigns. Advances in dating kept reshaping the scientific case. Public pressure and changing attitudes toward indigenous rights reshaped law and museum practice. In the early 1990s, after years of negotiation and protest, the remains were returned to country and reburied with Aboriginal ceremony, an act that acknowledged that scientific knowledge could not be ethically separated from the people whose ancestors it sought to study. The Lake Mungo story is two discoveries in one, a revelation about the antiquity and complexity of human life in Australia, and a revelation about the limits of science divorced from community. It exposed a form of bureaucratic and scientific entitlement that many described as conspiratorial because it privileged institutional claims over indigenous sovereignty and spiritual law. The outcome, new rules, repatriation policies, and a broader respect for Aboriginal custodianship, did not erase the past, but it reshaped how archaeology, museums, and governments would behave thereafter. Today, visitors walk the lunettes of Mungo and see ochred sand and wind-sculpted ridges. Beneath that surface lies a truth once buried. Ancient people lived, mourned, and honored each other here tens of thousands of years ago. And when scientists finally listened and returned what was not theirs to keep, the act itself became part of the discovery, not merely of the deep past, but of a modern responsibility to reconcile knowledge with respect.